right, we're right at 11:30, so I think we are going to get started here. So Dave's going to come up and just kind of continue with a little bit of what he shared earlier, but then we're going to leave some time at the end for our question and answer, and so we're going to try to wrap this up by 12:15. So we got like 45 minutes, so I'm sure we'll wish we had more time, but Dave, glad you're here.
Thank you. Thanks, Pastor. Well, again, it's great to be here with you today. Let's open a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness to us, for giving us wisdom when we need it, and especially for allowing us to ask you for it. Help us to do that on a regular basis. Be with our time this morning, and we trust it'll be profitable for your work. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, you know, as you were preaching this morning, Pastor, the thought kept running through my mind, I should have listened to my wife. Because my wife said last night, I have a talk that I've given a number of times, and it's called Dare to be a Daniel. See, next time, there you go. So I'll have to tell my wife she was right once again, you know. You know how all that goes. But I actually do want to read just a few verses here. Daniel 11:32. Halfway through the verse says, turn to God to, I'm sorry, in my eyes here. The people who know their God will display strength and take action. And another version says, and stand firm. And then the next verse, and those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Folks, you're the ones that have insight. You have the word of the Lord. You have the Bible. You can see what's going on in our country today. And we're being called upon at a time right now to stand firm. Can't say it any other way. We need to all stand firm. I want to take a little bit of time this morning. There's so much that we could go through. But one of the biggest assaults that I see happening right now on the family is on parental rights and the rights of parents to raise and teach their children and bring them up the way they think they should be brought up. And what do we see in public schools? Bills that will allow for teachers and administrators to perform sex change operations on your child without you even knowing about it, and they won't tell you. Bills to allow them to take your child, your daughter, to have an abortion, and you would never know about it unless something somehow God intervened and you found out somewhere else. So these are important things, and I think in the context of this election season and everything that's going on, it's very important for us to understand our constitutional rights, understand the biblical foundation for our rights and where they come from. Again, I thank you, Ron, for having me here today and for the opportunity to speak with you. As we all know, the Obergefell case, which is now 5-6 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court, where Justice Kennedy at the time approved same-sex marriage, and he based it on personal autonomy. Have you ever heard that phrase? Your personal autonomy. That seems to be the highest value in our culture right now, in our country, is personal autonomy. Instead of responsibility and living within your means and all of that, it's that whatever you want, you should be able to do. You should have the personal autonomy to do it. That case is just one more thing. I mean, we could go back to cases for the last 100 years and show the progression of how we've gotten here, you know. But we don't have time for that this morning. But a couple of books I would recommend, if many of you know Dr. Erwin Lutzer. He's been at Maranatha many times, gotten to know him a little bit. He's written a couple books recently. We Will Not Be Silenced is one, and the other is No Reason to Hide. And those two books I would strongly encourage you to get, and especially if you have kids, teenagers, college age, whatever, they need to read those books. Because we will not be silenced is you're seeing that happen right before your eyes. They want to silence you. They want to silence me. They want to silence Pastor from giving a sermon like he gave this morning. They want to silence that because they don't agree with us. And that is so unconstitutional and un-American. I mean, I could go on with all the pejorative phrases. But that's what we're facing right now, is we are facing a society that has abandoned any kind of basis on the Word of God or Christian faith or background for our beliefs and our system of government. It's been abandoned. And that's why we're seeing the fruit of that right now. And that comes back to, I think one of the underlying things is the rights of parents. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about where does that come from, and to encourage you as parents that you do have rights and that you need to stand up for them if they're being trampled on. You need to stand up and be heard. And now is the time. I have people say, you're always talking about the stuff that's going on, and it sounds so terrible, all of that. But folks, this is a great time to be alive. I mean, to think that God has let us be here today for a time like this, like Esther, for such a time as this. We should feel honored that God's letting us be here during this time so that we can stand. That doesn't mean there may not be consequences. It doesn't mean you might not lose your job. I might lose my job the way the legal realm is going and what they're trying to force lawyers to do. I'm not going to do. And so I'm sure I'm going to be facing that sort of thing. I'm not as worried about it. I'm an old guy at this point, But my son, he's just getting started in his career. He's going to be facing this big time. So where do we get parental authority and your right as a parent to raise and educate your kids? Well, I'll just give you, I'm not going to, for time's sake, I'm not going to go, I usually go through the verses, but let me just give you some if you want to jot them down. Deuteronomy 4, chapter 4, verses 9 to 10. Deuteronomy 6, 4 to 7, when you stand up, when you rise down, when you lay down, you teach your children. Deuteronomy 11, 18 to 19. Joshua 24, 1 through 15. Psalm 78, 1 to 7. Proverbs is just full of, but Proverbs 4 especially, 1 through 13. Ephesians 6, 1 through 4. And Colossians 3, 20 to 21. Now, everything we're going to talk about here, always understand, again, we're not getting into it today, but 1 Timothy chapter 3, Romans 13, we all have a duty to what? Treat those in authority, the king, the government, with respect and honor that it's due. But that doesn't mean that you sit back and just do whatever the government says, okay? What did the apostles do when they were told in Acts, don't preach in Jesus' name? What did they do? They preached. They disobeyed. So there's a real biblical basis for civil disobedience. And I think that's another thing Will and I, Professor Wagner and I, are working on right now, is to start teaching that in churches around the country and around the world. Your rights for civil disobedience and how to properly do it, and to not be out there beating people over the head with your Bible, or pulling out your gun, but to do it in a way that's biblical and to appeal to authority. We just saw that in the text of the sermon this morning, right? What did Daniel do? 2 times I heard this morning. First about he was supposed to eat certain foods, right, and stuff. Did he hold a protest? Did he start, attacking those in authority over him? No. He went to them and appealed to the authority and asked for accommodation. That is something we are able to do here in our system also. And then when the guard came to kill him, what did he do? He appealed to the authority, asked for time, and went from there. So that's underlying all of this that we're talking about here today. But traditionally in our country, parents have always been found to have total authority over their child's education, And even though it's not absolute, right, because you can't neglect or beat your child, okay? You can't refuse to teach your child. That's not proper. So there are obviously limits. But in general, a caring, loving parent has the absolute right to control the education and upbringing of their children. But this can be kind of hard to quantify at times. But I'll summarize a bunch of things here without going through the case law directly. But essentially, the courts have said there are two things that education is supposed to do for kids. And that's why children should be educated. The first is that children are literate, they can read and write, okay, and be self-sufficient members of our society. That's number one. Number two, that a child can grow up and know how to participate in our legal system. Those are really the two functions that the courts have said are why kids need to be educated. Now, do you hear anything in there about gender fluidity and pronoun use and on? No. Now, schools are doing that, but that gets into another issue. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it doesn't include socialization of the kids to the way the state wants them to grow up. Pierce versus Society of Sisters, famous U.S. Supreme Court case from over 100 years ago now already. Well, almost 100 years ago, 1925. The Supreme Court said this: the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in our union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. Did you hear that? You would never know that today from listening to those in authority. Listen to this: the child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the duty, the high duty, to recognize and prepare the child for additional obligations. Our Supreme Court has made it crystal clear. You as parents have the right to raise and educate your child. Now, Thomas Jefferson, famous Democrats love quoting Thomas Jefferson, right? And those, a lot of times on the other side of the aisle. Here's what he said: it is better to tolerate the rare instance of a parent refusing to let his child be educated than to shock the common feelings and ideas by forcible education of a child against the will of the father. You know Thomas Jefferson said that? That we should never let the government force any particular education. In Meyer versus Nebraska, a companion case, an earlier case, 1923, U.S. Supreme Court said that the liberty rights of parents include not merely the freedom from bodily restraint, but the right to contract or to engage in the common occupations of life or to gain knowledge, but it's also to marry, establish a home, and bring up children. Meyer versus Nebraska. Our Michigan Supreme Court, People versus Bennett, and other cases have ruled similarly. We were instrumental in getting a law passed in Michigan. How many of you knew this law was in the public school code in Michigan? And those who like to look things up, it's MCL, Michigan Compiled Law, 380.10. It is the natural fundamental right of parents and legal guardians to determine and direct the care, teaching, and education of their children. The public schools of this state serve the needs of pupils by cooperating with the pupils' parents and legal guardians to develop the pupils' intellectual capabilities and vocational skills in a safe and positive environment. Did you know that was in our public school code? I helped write that over 30 years ago, and we got it put in to our state law. This is probably one of the most ignored statutes right now, and we're getting ready to start using this to fight back against a lot of the things the public schools are doing. But the reason we say it's a natural fundamental right of parents in this law to raise and educate your kids is because in the legal scheme of things out there, the highest scrutiny that a court will give to an action by a government entity is called strict scrutiny, and it has to be based on a fundamental right, a fundamental constitutional right. So in Michigan, our legislature has said, you have a fundamental constitutional right to raise and educate your kids, which means when you get to court on these cases, the courts have to give it the highest level of scrutiny, which usually means we win on those kinds of cases. Now, again, in the interest of time here, you just need to understand that there are many parts of our history and our constitutions that support this, not just case law. The Michigan Constitution. Listen to Article 8 of our Michigan Constitution, Section 1. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and happiness of mankind, schools and means of education shall forever be encouraged. That's right out of the Northwest Ordinance, was put into our Michigan Constitution. Did you hear that first part? Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary. This section is the section dealing with education in Michigan of children. So our state constitution says the basis of our education is religion, morality, and knowledge. And it starts with religion and morality. This is the starting point. That's okay. So you need to understand as a parent, you have the right to raise and educate your kids. This is not a license the state grants to you or a privilege like driving on the roads to get here today. That's a privilege. You know, the roads are maintained by the government. This is not a privilege. You have a constitutional right that the government is not to infringe upon. So whenever you're dealing with government officials, and especially in the area of education and control, keep these things in mind and help try to re-educate them into understanding the real basis of their authority. These public schools only have authority that's been given to them by you, by parents, through legislators who passed laws. Their authority is not innate. It's not some separate authority that can overrule you. Okay? Again, short of you abusing or neglecting your child. So, parents have that right. You also have the right to be informed and to know what's going on, which is directly going counter to a lot of the things that are going on today. And this is where, you know, I'll talk just briefly about the pronoun issue, you know, with kids now or teachers or other people saying, well, Johnny thinks he's Mary now, and so you have to use pronouns for Johnny that are she and her and, you know, all of that. And I'm sure you've heard all the arguments, right? Well, you're just being compassionate. Don't you have empathy for little Johnny because he's a little confused right now and you don't want to upset him, right? All those arguments. And so, you know, Johnny at 6 years old, he knows he's a girl now. Okay. You know, those kinds of arguments. Well, that's just simply not true. The pronoun issue, starting from a basic starting point, is you are being asked, I'm being asked to lie. Okay, so understand that. They are asking you to lie and participate in that lie by using those pronouns. What does the Bible say? Male and female. What did Jesus say? Male and female. He created them, right? You go back to Genesis. This is a standard, mainstream, biblical Christian point of view that they are now directly undermining and threatening you and saying if you don't disavow that basic biblical teaching and if you don't participate in the lie, we're coming after you. Now, I have already faced this a couple of times, and I kind of jokingly say to Stephen and others, I said, let's get our bond money ready to go because I'm going to need to get bailed out here. But I've been in court a couple times where court officials, a judge or a referee, have looked at me and said, the other attorney objects because I wasn't using the proper pronoun for a person that was involved in the case or on the stand or something like that. Now, again, I wasn't being disrespectful. I was using the person's last name. I wasn't, you know, calling him he when he wanted to be, you know, but I was using an alternative. But because I wouldn't use their pronouns, they asked the judge, the other attorney, to order me to use the pronoun. And in one case in particular, I thought, okay, this is it. I'm heading off. I think this judge, he's known as a liberal judge. He is not from around here. He looked at me and he said, well, what do you have to say in response to that? And I'll go, well, Your Honor, I won't lie. And I just looked at him, you know. And I said, Judge, you know the rules of ethics for attorneys and judges means I have a duty of candor and honesty to the court, and I'm not supposed to lie to the court. So if you're going to order me to lie, then you need to know I won't do it, and I will appeal your ruling. Okay? And that judge looked at me like I was from outer space, like I was some kind of alien or something. And then I quoted a couple of cases, you know, West Virginia versus Barnett. Your Honor, government cannot compel a person to speak in a way that violates their conscience. If you're going to compel me to speak in such a way, I just want it clear on the record that's what you're doing. And you're violating the U.S. Supreme Court rulings on speech and these issues. And the judge just kind of, we looked at each other, and I could just see it. He really wanted to order me, and he backed down. And he just said, well, we'll deal with this at a later time or whatever. And I'm, okay, you know. But what do you do when you're at work and somebody, your boss tells you, you have to use somebody else's pronouns? What are you going to do? See, that's not government action. This is another thing where people get confused sometimes. Everybody says, well, I have my constitutional rights. I have my right to free speech and free exercise of religion and all that. Yes, you do, okay? When it's dealing with the government trying to stop you from doing it, you have those constitutional protections. If it's a private entity doing it to you, there's no First Amendment right. There's no constitutional right because it's not involving government action. So what are you going to do as an employee if your boss tells you you have to do something or you're fired? A little closer to home, isn't it? Okay? Now, keep in mind that's not what we're really talking about right now, but you do have other protections other than just constitutional protections. Title VII in the Federal Code, which covers employees, all employment situations, says employers have to provide accommodations for religious beliefs, and they have certain things they have to follow. So you do have other ways you can stand on and fight back. But you need to understand that's going to be a problem, and that's what we're facing here more and more. What are you going to do when you're at school? You know, and a teacher says to you, you better use that pronoun or you're kicked out of my class. You know? Now, are you going to yell at the teacher, scream at the judge? Do it? Of course not. Did Daniel do that? No, he used wisdom and tact, right? He appealed to authority. Always do that, because that will help in the long run. But this pronoun issue is one, you know, that you're just going to see it. And I always like to say, who are the science deniers here? You know, I mean, XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes. Hey, you know, who's denying science? You know, chromosomes are not social constructs. Did you hear that? Chromosomes are not social constructs. You're either XX or you're XY. And we could talk about that 1 in 100 million exception thing or something and all that. That's for a different, you can deal with that. For 99.9999% of all the situations, you aren't dealing with that, okay? So who are the science deniers here? But again, always when you're in these situations, if you face them, have compassion. I mean, did Jesus go up and just smack people around and say, oh, you're an idiot, admit that you're, no. He didn't respond like that. Unless he was overturning the money tables in the temple, so I guess I can't say every time. But in general, no, he showed compassion to people, didn't he? He took them where they were, and he went from there. But this is why we need, and we're going to need, more and more Christians getting into the legal field and being ready for these kinds of battles, because it's only going to intensify and get worse. So this is not, understand this is not an issue of failing to have empathy or failing to treat someone with compassion. It's a violation of your religious beliefs and your conscience. That's what this is. And when you see it in that context, it kind of changes it a little, doesn't it? Have you, how many of you remember Alexander Solzhenitsyn? You know, the older folks in here remember him. Okay. The famous Russian dissident came to the U.S., you know, served, you know, kept in the gulags for decades, that sort of thing. He made the famous comment, "Live not by lies." He said that's how communism prevailed for so many decades in Russia and China, because people lived by the lies because they figured there was nothing else they could do about it. And so outwardly they would obey the lie. Inwardly they would, you know, understand it's a lie. Imagine what that does in your head, what that does to a person. You have to live like that. There's a book by Rod Dreher, D-R-E-H-E-R, Live Not by Lies. If you haven't read that book, that's a really good one too. So understand, words are tools. Redefinitions of words are tools that are being used to advance an agenda that they can't get through legislatively or in other ways. So understand that. The government has no right to decide which words you're going to use or compel you in any way along those lines. So back to your rights as a parent. Whenever an official, especially a school official, I've done a lot of education law things over the years. Whenever a school official tells you, or a government official says, well, it's the law, you have to do whatever, 1, 2, 3. It's the law. You don't know what my experience is? 90% of the time, it's not the law. So don't be, I mean, people get intimidated, you know. You got a government official telling me this is the law. Why would I question that? Because they're doing one of two things. They're either outright lying to you and they know it, and they're just trying to intimidate you to force you to do what they want, or they haven't been trained properly and they don't know and they think it is the law. So what's an easy way to handle that? Easy way. Whenever anybody tells you that, they're at your door, whatever it is. That's interesting. Show me the law. Can you give me the quote? What's the citation of that law? I'd like to look it up. And I'd like to call this lawyer in Lansing because he told me that wasn't the law. Okay? Always ask for the law. And you'd be amazed how many times you won't hear anything from them again, because they'll understand that there is no law, that they don't have anything to base it on. Or they'll show you like a policy. Like this happens with DHHS all the time in dealing with parents. DHHS has a policy book this bigger than this thick. I mean, it's huge with all of their policies. And they'll pull out their policy book and say, well, here the policy says right here, boom, boom, boom. And then I always just kind of smile and I go, well, that's interesting. Can you show me in that policy book of yours where it says I have to comply with your policy? That's a policy for you, right? That's what you have to do as an employee of DHHS. Well, yeah. Well, I don't work for DHHS. You aren't paying me a dime. I don't have to follow that policy. What are you talking about? And they'll be so flummoxed, they're not going to know what to do, because they just assume that because they have to follow it, that means you have to follow it. Well, you don't. So always understand that and stick to your guns on these things. Remember Proverbs 15:1, soft answer turns away wrath. You know, using tact again in what you're doing. So when you're dealing with folks in the community at large, when you're dealing with officials, that sort of thing, be wise, you know. Don't go in just yelling and screaming at them. That doesn't get you anywhere. And frankly, is that the way we should act? Of course not. But that doesn't mean you don't speak up, and it doesn't mean you don't say things with compassion and care for everyone else. One thing I always recommend too, especially with educational things going on right now, always look at the board policies of the particular school district, because invariably you will find things in those policies you can use. And remember, again, board policies are binding on the board in the school, okay? Not you. You know, you hear this argument all the time from school boards, especially recently. They've been passing these new policies to enact transgender rules to allow boys to be in the girls' showers and locker rooms and all of that. And they're saying they have to do it because we'll lose federal funding if we don't. So it's a money issue. Don't ever fall for that either. If they're doing something wrong or harmful, number one, a school board can refuse the money. They don't have to take it. And number two, there are other protections within the law where a school board can refuse to do certain things, which again is beyond what we're talking about today. But as a parent, remember 1 Peter 3:15. What does that say? Always be ready to give an answer, right? Now I know that's in the context of the gospel. I'm twisting it somewhat, this way, but it's a good thing to do in every area of life. Always be ready to give an answer for why you believe a certain way you do. Don't shoot from the hip or the lip, when you're doing this. Seek counsel. Other parents maybe who've been through it before. Other lawyers, Great Lakes Justice Center. Other school officials who agree with you. Educators, elected officials in your township, wherever, whoever you're dealing with. Seek counsel from trusted people you know. Seek counsel from your pastor, from those who are other strong Christians in your community. And yeah. But you always want to give calm and reasoned responses. Always. And let me tell you another thing I've learned over the years. If you don't know the answer to something, admit it. I mean, I get questions sometimes, and I go, I've never had that question before. I think I kind of know the answer, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. Let me research it and get back to you on that. Do you see any problem with that kind of response? Okay, if somebody asks you something and you're not exactly sure how to respond, just say, well, let me check that out and I'll get back with you and give you my response to that. That's another way to handle that sort of thing. And then recruit like-minded people. Start here, with your church, and move out in the community. There's other folks at other churches who agree with you on the issues and things like that. Again, linguistic manipulation is something that we should not put up with, and we need to be aware and be informed. Now, I'll just mention briefly here, I know we're in election season. Churches don't endorse candidates because of the law right now, 501c3. That's actually another lawsuit that Great Lakes is involved in. We filed in federal court in Texas, and we have challenged the Johnson Amendment, which is the law in the IRS code that says churches can't endorse or lobby on particular issues. And so I'm aware of a church here in Michigan right now that has at least verbally been told that because the pastor gave a sermon against abortion, that the IRS is going to come after them to try to take away their 501c3 status, because they view that as political. The abortion issue is political. Exactly. So we're challenging that law, and we're trying to get that thrown out. That's another thing we're doing at Great Lakes right now. Man, I'm already running out of time. Let me just end with this. I did want to tell you this one other thing, if you're not aware. If you have kids in public schools, okay, and they're teaching this transgender stuff, you need to call us, because there is a part of the public school code that says the school cannot give sex education without parental notification, number one, and giving you the right to opt out of it. So they cannot teach this gender fluidity stuff to your kids without telling you they're doing it and giving you the right to opt out. And you say, well, where does it say that in the law? Well, because again, these people twist words and they expand what words mean. This is how it works against them. The public school code says sex education gives you these rights, notice, right to opt out, and all those things for any kind of sex education. Well, guess what they did? They changed the word sex legally. So now that includes gender identity, sexual orientation, and all those things. So now under their own words that they've used, sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity. You now have the right to use that law to opt out. So that's Michigan, but a lot of states have the same or similar laws. So keep that in mind. You want to mess with your local school, in a good way, go in and just say, I want notice of every class where sex is being taught, and then define sex the way they do it, with sexual orientation, gender identity, et cetera, et cetera. And then I want the right to opt out. Boy, you'll get the lawyers scurrying around on that one at your local public school. So be sure to do that. But we are in election season. Let me just say again, we don't endorse, I know your church doesn't endorse particular candidates, but it doesn't mean you can't give out information. So if you haven't seen Citizens for Traditional Values has a voter guide, you can go to their website, Citizens for Traditional Values. And they do not endorse. We've got these out at our church because all it does is give you information, and it tells you on certain topics where the candidates stand. Well, you can look at the topic and go, oh, that person's that, okay, then I'm not voting for them. It gives you the information you need, but it doesn't endorse a candidate or oppose a candidate. It just gives you information. And, for example, for Michigan Supreme Court and things like that. So go to their website, CTV, and you can get this, and you can get these for your church too, if you want to get them out. Family Research Council has a similar thing. Look at their website. Right to Life of Michigan has a voter guide. There are lots of sources out there and resources that you can use. So at the end of my Dare to be a Daniel talk, when I do that, I talk about the fact that Daniel did all the things that we were hearing this morning in the message, and using tact and using wisdom. And how do you do that? And what do you do? That sort of thing. Let me just give you one example, and then we'll wrap up, and I'll open it up for some questions here. I had a situation with, we represented probably thousands of home educators over the last 40 years around the state. And so I had the privilege to represent a lot of folks in court cases where they were going after them, especially back in the 80s and early 90s before we won the case in the Michigan Supreme Court, the Young case that freed up homeschooling in Michigan. But I remember going to a pretrial one time down in a southeast part of the state, county, and they were prosecuting a couple for teaching their kids, pulling their kids out of the public school and teaching them at home. And just to give you a quick background, this family were like pillars in the community. They ran the PTA. The husband had raised something like $50,000. Now remember, this is like 35 years ago, to help refurbish the football field at the public school. All their kids were in the public schools. Their son, who was a senior at the time, was the star of the football team. These people were enmeshed in the public schools, solid Christian people. One day, their son's driving back. They let kids go off campus, the seniors, for lunch. He was driving back, got T-boned, and was in critical condition in the hospital and was almost dead. So the wife finds out, calls the husband, and of course, imagine, you're a mom, and you get this word that your son might be dead or dying. Get to the hospital immediately. So she calls her husband, says, you go pick up the kids at the middle school. I'm going to go to the high school, pick up our two boys there, and let's all meet back at the hospital. And get everybody, and call pastor and get people praying. I remember they were doing that. So the mom gets to the high school, runs into the office. Now remember, she knows everybody there. The secretaries, everybody that's there. She knows them. They deal with them all the time. And she rushes up, tells them what happened. They're horrified. She says, I'm just here to get the boys. I wanted to let you know I'm going to get them, and we're heading to the hospital. And she turns to start walking out of the office. The principal happened to be standing there. And he goes, wait a minute. This is, I'll say, Smith. You can't get your boys. And she's like, what? Did you not just hear what I said? We have to get to the hospital. It's an emergency. And he said, it's only 1:30. They don't get released till 2:45. You can come back at 2:45 and get them. And she's like, what are you talking about? And the principal says, you don't have the right to take them out right now. They're in our school. You cannot take them. And so she said, I about lost my Christianity at that point. I said a few choice words that I regret saying, And I said, I'm going to get the boys. Arrest me if you want to. And the principal goes, I will. And she goes, go ahead and try. And she turns around and starts walking out. He had the school police officer that was there at the time arrest her. So she's hauled off to jail while her son is fighting for his life at the hospital. Now the father, they're all at the hospital, and they're like, what's going on? Where's my wife at? What's going on? He finds out what happened. He was close personal friends with the sheriff in that county. Called the sheriff up and read him the riot act. Of course, the sheriff didn't know anything about it at that point. Got his wife out right away. Well, very next day, they pulled all 6 of their kids out of the public school and started homeschooling. Well, you can imagine, that's a lot of kids, that's a lot of money to that school district. So they went after him, prosecuted him. So we're at a pretrial hearing, and I show up. And usually when you go to a pretrial hearing, you have 1 or 2 people, a prosecutor, maybe somebody from the school, and you sit in a room and you try to work things out. There's only like 2 or 3 of you together. I walk into this room that they sent me to. It was a county commissioner room. It was a huge conference table with 20 people sitting around it, and with 1 spot open. So I walked in, I went, oh, well, this can't be right. Sorry I interrupted your meeting. And I turned to walk out, and a guy stands up at the end. He turned out to be the assistant prosecutor. He goes, no, are you Mr. Coleman? Yeah. No, you're in the right spot. And I looked around, I go, well, this is going to be interesting. So I go and I sit down. And they had put me and set it up so I was right across directly from the superintendent of the schools. And this guy starts right in with, all they have to do is your clients put the kids back in the public schools Monday morning, everything will be forgiven. We love, the Smiths and the kids and and all this. And so he's going on and on. And finally I thought, I'm thinking to myself, well, we're not going to have any resolution here. So this guy's going to be a witness. I want to try to see if I can get under his skin a little bit. So I looked at him and I said, maybe if you hadn't had my client arrested when her son was almost dead, we wouldn't be sitting here today, would we? And that guy just blew up. And he leans across the table. I was shaking his finger at me. He's all red in the face, screaming at me. When those kids cross the schoolhouse door, they're mine. And the sooner the parents understand that, the better. And he sits back. And you could have heard a pin drop in that room. So I took my pad of paper and I slammed it on the table next to me, the person next to me, with a pen. And I said, I want your name, address, phone number, and your position. And I want everybody in this room to sign this pad of paper. Nobody leave this room. And the prosecutor goes, What do you need that for? And I stood up, I said, because I just won this case. I said, I'm going to get a jury of 6 parents on the stand, and I'm going to put this guy on the stand and ask him if he just said what he just said. Those parents are going to want to lynch him by the time I'm done. And I said, and I know people like you, and I looked right at him. You'll lie. You'll go on the stand, you'll get under oath, swear to tell the truth, and you will lie. But you know what? I have 20 other people in this room, And I dare say there's some God-fearing Christians in this room. And I saw 4 or 5 people going like this, And they aren't going to lie for you. And so go ahead and lie. I'll get them on the stand and prove that's what you said. I just won this case. Thank you very much. And I said to the prosecutor, if I don't get everybody's information, I'm going to the judge. Nobody better leave this room. So I come out, and my clients are out there. What was going on in there? There was a lot of yelling, and what's going on? I said, it's just legal stuff. Don't worry about it. No big deal. And we were there, and about 5 minutes later, prosecutor walks out with my tablet empty, no information on it. So I'm like, okay, let's go find the judge. Nobody better leave that room. And he goes, no, you don't understand. We're dismissing the case. Now, I tell that story because it shows the mindset. And let me say this. 95% of the public school officials, DHHS workers, everybody that I work with on cases and stuff are totally fine. And they're not like that. But you don't hear about those cases where things work out. You hear about the 5% or the 10% where you have people like that, you know. And the problem we have now is it's growing. Now it's 20, 25%, and it's growing. And that's what we're dealing with. So I always end my Dare to Be a Daniel thing with, I'm going to inflict this on you. How many of you remember the old Dare to Be a Daniel gospel hymn? Well, here we go. Standing by a purpose true, heeding God's command, honor them, the faithful few, all hail to Daniel's band. Many mighty men are lost, daring not to stand, who for God would be a host by joining Daniel's band. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. Many giants, great and tall, stalking through the land, isn't that what we have today? Headlong to the earth would fall if met by Daniel's band. Hold the gospel banner high on to victory grand. Satan and his hosts defy and shout for Daniel's band. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. And that's what I challenge all of us here today. Dare to be a Daniel. You're going to be studying this in the coming weeks. At home. Will you be a Daniel at home with your own family and kids? What about at work? What about at school? What about with your neighbors? All around. I leave you with that challenge. Dare to be a Daniel. And I went way too long, but let me leave a few minutes for, yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, we're fighting all of that. There's been no bill passed yet. We've hired a lobbyist. Many of you might remember Tom Leonard, who's former Speaker of the House, as a Christian man, has been working behind the scenes. So far we've fought it off. But after the election, it's going to be lame duck. And especially if a certain party loses control, you might see that registration rearing its head again. So be aware. Yeah, we'll be a Michigan Christian Home Educators Association, Great Lakes. We're in the middle of fighting that. So, anybody else? Well, yes. Yeah, so they are held accountable in the sense of when they're challenged in court, and we win a lot of cases, okay? They're held accountable that way. But you're right, it's not coming out of their personal money or pocket. We've actually gotten attorney fees awarded to us from the government on a number of cases because they were so egregious in what they were doing. But let me tell you where the true accountability lands is voting, and it's coming up in 2 weeks, and it's getting people out of those positions and challenging those sorts of things and getting legislators in place who will pass laws to rein in people like that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you get into, that's a U.S. attorney, it's a criminal charge, and so it's up to the U.S. attorney. They have total discretion. And again, who appoints the U.S. attorney? We all know which party appointed all the U.S. attorneys that are currently serving in this country. That hopefully, potentially will change, but we don't know, you know. So I agree with you. I mean, it is frustrating, but we need to, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what we need to start standing up and doing. And that's what Great Lakes does, and that's what I know a lot of other groups are out there doing. right. Yeah, that's where it starts. But it can work its way down too, even down to local school boards and things like that. So, well, I know I probably went way too long. I apologize for that. Thanks again for being here today.